Okay. Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for attending this last session of our Spring 2025 webinar series. We are very excited. After two great sessions, we are very excited to have Valérie for concluding this term of our sessions. And she will talk about democratic discourse in the age of platforms and present us an ethnography of Reddit, Canadian Political Reddits. Thank you very much again for attending and presenting your research, Valérie. Floor is yours. You can just go ahead and start presenting it.
Thank you very much for having me. So my name is Valérie Kindarji. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Toronto, and I'm also a researcher for the Digital Transparency Research Cluster. That's at the University of British Columbia. I've put the QR code there if anyone is interested. We do research on AI ethics, digital and AI literacy, trying to advance these pillars of research. And we are an interdisciplinary group, so a group of political scientists and librarians and computer scientists all working towards this goal. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the second paper of my three-paper dissertation on democratic vulnerability in the digital age. So the question that I ask is, why are democracies, which are theoretically resilient systems of government, concerned about disordered information? Disordered information is essentially the umbrella term I use to describe a combination of disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, etc. The argument that I make is that disordered information exploits the vulnerabilities in democracy's inherent characteristics, the free market, the free marketplace of ideas, and the cumbersome bureaucracy. The idea is that the things that make democracies are also vulnerabilities and reasons for which the demand of disordered information is so high. What I'm hoping for my dissertation is that I can provide actionable policy recommendations for modern democracy so that they can actually go and tackle the threat of disinformation. The argument is that there's a lot of incentives for disinformation built into democratic institutions. So again, the same things which make democracies function, free flows of information, make disinformation inevitable and make disinformation actually welcome. So by exploiting neoliberalism, by exploiting free flows of information, by exploiting cumbersome bureaucratic structures that are quite slow to change, disordered information really thrives and works to fragment the shared social reality, which itself is also crucial to a functioning democracy. Other authors have made this argument before, but I take a different approach. I argue that to understand how disordered information kind of tears at that fabric of democracy, we have to examine how democracies have responded to the threat of disordered information or how they attempt to respond. So, in order to do this, we do have to compare across different democracies, which have adopted different strategies with obviously varying levels of success. But by looking at these concrete responses, comparing them across regions and across time, we can understand the actual causal mechanisms that are underpinning the threat posed by disordered information. Honestly, the reason for which I became quite interested in this is because I was frustrated. I kept reading in the literature that disinformation is bad for democracy or it's problematic for democratic processes, and I wanted to understand exactly why this was the case. So I am a political scientist. I study international relations and comparative politics. So by nature, by trade, I compare across regions and across countries. So I study North America, the Baltics, and Scandinavia more precisely. I've done fieldwork in all the regions. I use a combination of methods, qualitative methods. So I do semi-structured interviews, process tracing, thematic analysis, and netnography. Today, I'm going to focus on netnography. And I'm actually going to spend quite some time talking about the method because I think it's quite interesting and I knew nothing about it before starting. And this is my first netnography, so I thought it might be interesting to share what it is and how it works. So, to give you a brief overview of the dissertation itself, I'll very briefly discuss the two other papers, but again, we're going to focus on that third paper. So in the first paper, I argue that free market principles make democracies vulnerable to disinformation. The question I ask myself is, why is it that in countries with really big investments in big tech, we don't see digital literacy initiatives? We don't see concerted digital literacy initiatives. So why is it that in countries like Estonia and Finland, for example, we see these concerted responses, but in places like North America, Canada, and the US, we are not seeing? The argument I make is essentially that countries that prioritize the economic development of digital technologies and decide not to pair this with educational responses will fall behind and become a lot more vulnerable to disinformation. There's an entire historical process tracing argument here where we really have to go back to the 1990s to understand when democracies liberalized their telecommunications infrastructure, those democracies which decided to liberalize their telecommunications infrastructure while investing in digital education are performing way better now when it comes to digital literacy. I'll spare you the boring parts, but that's high level what it was. In the third paper, I make the argument that um, modern democracies that have delayed the implementation of digital government initiatives, so transparent e-government, such as transparent portals for citizens to communicate with government or to see what policy is being passed, democracies that have delayed this implementation for a variety of cumbersome bureaucratic reasons will be a lot more vulnerable to disinformation because they are not fixing that citizen government link that makes people trust their institutions. And so we're in a crisis of institutional trust. There are ways to remedy that, and a lot of democracies are just not taking these steps. And finally, what this paper is talking about is democracies which, and I'll explain, passively outsource the public square to social media platforms will be a lot more vulnerable. Let's dive into this paper. We're going to talk about the theoretical, not too long, I won't bore you for too long, and then we'll jump into the ethnography. It's still very much a work in progress, but I'd love to share with you how far I've come, the challenges that I've experienced as well with this research. So in the second paper, I argue that free flows of information and the free marketplace of ideas that is actually generated from these flows are both a fundamental tenet of democracy and a vulnerability for these political systems as well. So let's think right now about the social and the political context in most modern democracies. So we know that the physical public sphere is contracting. So the physical public sphere, think of these communicative environments in democracies which allow for us to share ideas and perspectives, to share public opinion on matters of interest. So these can be tangible and intangible environments. The physical public sphere, so the actual places where individuals can exist basically without the expectation of spending money, or places where you can interact with others if you choose to do so, is really shrinking in democracies. There's less and less places like this, and this is a phenomenon that has been occurring steadily for many, many decades. One of the issues is that formerly public spaces are often bought off and they're turned into spaces where you're expected to purchase things, or you're transiting, right? So it's spaces where you're just transiting from one destination to the next. And then sometimes what happens is that these public spaces are privatized. So what happens is that developers create areas, they buy off these areas to increase the density of their projects, but in exchange they'll provide public access to these areas. But the problem is that these spaces, because they're being developed by developers, they're prioritizing commercial objectives over community engagement and accessibility. And so it's limiting freedom, and it's creating these spaces which are hostile or just not conducive to gathering and exchange. So we can see that these built areas, this built environment has a real impact on modifying citizen behavior. If there isn't, a bench or grass or other agreeable infrastructure that it's conducive to exchange, it's really going to modify the behavior that we engage in these spaces. So the public physical space is really, really contracting. It's getting smaller. And partially due to this phenomenon, individuals are meeting a lot less in person. And this is particularly acute in neoliberal economic systems. So the proliferation of individualist values, it exerts pressure on collectivist values. There's a decrease in communal interactions, participation in public spaces. Individuals tend to prioritize solitary pursuits and personal projects that are generally geared around self-optimization and self-improvement. So, in short, because we lack physical space to do so, and because our time is increasingly scarce, we're interacting with strangers less and less. We're interacting with people with whom we disagree less and less. We're also self-selecting into these groups with whom we agree. Hence the photo that I shared over here, the screenshot of this news article where during COVID, friends and families were torn apart. And I'm sure each of you has experienced some form of disagreement with family members or friends, wherein either you lost that friendship or that family link, or you just decided to stop talking about politics or stop talking about society because it became quite taboo in your circles. So what's happening is that because the public sphere is contracting, we're seeing a lot of migration of all of these political and social discourses online. So these conversations that people might have had in person are now happening online. But as we all know, we all are interested in social media. There's an entire political economy underpinning social media platforms. And so the access to information on social media does not mimic the access to information you might have had with in-person discourse. There's entire frameworks of economic incentives that dictate the information that we actually see and interact with. Now, social media platforms, as we know, they need a constant influx of information to survive. So this invites a lot of information and often very low quality information. And here's the idea, where's the idea of the marketplace of ideas comes in. So the marketplace of ideas in democracies has really expanded. There's a lot more ideas. And in this free marketplace of ideas, which again is a really fundamental tenet of democracies, ideas really compete for acceptance, much like goods compete for acceptance in a capitalist market, which is why it's called the marketplace of ideas. So ideas which gain prominence are those which are appealing or ideas which really respond to a need. Again, think of these cheap, low quality goods that also flood a capitalist market. In the same way, needs are created in a capitalist market, products are created to respond to these new and often fabricated needs. So, with platforms seeking constantly this provocative information, this abundance of information, the marketplace of ideas expands. There's more ideas, more perspectives, there's more hot takes, as we call them. And what happens is that it really challenges our shared reality and it distorts and it splits our understanding of what's important, what's a priority, and who is trustworthy. And so we know the public sphere is contracting, the public square is moving online. Spaces are these spaces are unconducive to democratic discourse because they operate with an entirely different framework of incentives. So the marketplace of ideas is expanding, it's challenging our shared reality, distorting our perception, very importantly, of other citizens. Because we're meeting a lot less in person, what we see of people with whom we disagree is through our phones on our social media platforms. And we're seeing a very curated version of these people, often the most inflammatory and provocative content and version of these people. And so it impacts our second order beliefs, which are the belief about what other people believe. So first order beliefs are what I believe, what you as a person believe. Second order beliefs are what you believe other people believe. And so as we meet in person less, as political conversations become more taboo in person, we're having these exchanges online in spaces that are not conducive to democratic values. We also know, thanks to excellent work that's been done in this space, Bayer is one, Forrestal is another one, that the built environment of social media really impacts the type of information that we see and it limits our ability to interact. In the same way that the lack of a bench or a I'm pointing there because that's where my backyard is. In the same way that the lack of a bench or a grassy area will modify your behavior, the built environment of social media will also modify what you can and cannot do. And so the argument that I'm making in this paper is that disordered information really exploits the free marketplace of ideas in democracies, which are increasingly outsourcing the public square to social media platforms. These platforms are obviously incompatible with democratic discourse. Now I've bored you with the theoretical, the theoretical part. Let's jump into the actual case selection and the methodology. So I wanted to look at social media platforms and understand how the built environment actually impacts the discourse, the conversations that we're having. How does it limit us? How does it benefit us? And then how does that shape our belief of other people? The reason I chose Canada is that I've done fieldwork in North America for the first paper, and so I had a very good understanding of the political and social context. I'm also Canadian, so I have a familiarity with the context as well. I speak both English and French, which really helped with bilingual posts as well. I didn't have to learn a whole new language in order to engage in the space. Also, there's a really interesting political context occurring right now in Canada. Usually we have very boring politics in Canada. We're a pretty boring democracy generally, but lately there's been a lot going on, and I'll walk you through it a little bit if you're not familiar. Essentially, what happened is that we had a prime minister called Justin Trudeau that was in power for 10 years, quite a long time. He leads the Liberal Party of Canada, which is a center-left party. For a long time, Trudeau did pretty well in the polls. At the tail end, especially towards COVID, because of the response of the federal government, there was a whole FUCK Trudeau movement that started occurring, especially in the west of Canada, in the western provinces, but it also moved to the eastern provinces as well. So a lot of hate and antagonism towards Trudeau. around November, when we started hearing whispers of the US beginning to threaten Canada with tariffs, this is a little bit before the annexation threats and the whole 51st state narratives. Around that time, something very interesting happened. In Trudeau's cabinet, his Minister of Finance disagreed with Trudeau on how to manage the threats coming from the US with tariffs. Chrystia Freeland, her name, had argued that we actually needed to prepare Canada in a much more concerted way and that Trudeau's approaches were not working. He wanted to give kind of payouts to Canadians. And she was saying, well, giving a $250 check is not going to help. We really need to start saving money so that we're prepared for these inevitable tariffs when they come. And what happened is that not only did Chrystia Freeland resign, but she wrote a very scathing letter towards Justin Trudeau's government and towards Justin Trudeau himself. And so the sentiment in Canada was very, very intense and polarized. People who hated Trudeau hated him even more. Even people who were quite supportive of Trudeau started having started having doubts. And so we had this very, very polarized environment in November up until December. And the Liberal Party predictably called a snap election around the time where the US started threatening Canada with annexation, started claiming that they wanted us to be the 51st state. And so what happened is that the Conservatives were doing very, very well in the polls up until the annexation threats. And then all of a sudden, the Liberals started doing very well in the polls. And the new leader of the Liberal Party, Mark Carney, who was a former banker, won by, I wouldn't say a landslide, still a minority government, but almost a majority government, very, very close. I think they're missing 2 seats to become a majority government. And so there was kind of almost a landslide victory. And the sentiment in Canada became quite united. People became quite patriotic in response to all of these changes. And so it's been a very tumultuous political environment, which invites a lot of what I like to call friction, right? So friction in conversations because the Conservatives were doing well, because there was so much Trudeau hate, because there was so much polarization, and then suddenly we became very united. It was a very strange time. And so Canada became a very, very interesting case study to understand how democratic discourse is engaged with online. And this is why I chose Canada. At the same time, Canada passed the Bill C-18, the Online News Act, which in a nutshell prevents media companies to have a presence on social media without paying their fair share, essentially, which led most major news outlets to just remove themselves from Canadian spheres. So if you're in Canada and you try to see the Twitter page of The Guardian, you can't see it. Now, that doesn't mean that other people aren't posting links to The Guardian or to BBC News or to La Presse, which is our French language newspaper, but the actual news, the press cannot do so. Now, what's happened as a result is that because these legitimate news institutions are not able to publish in Canada, there's been a kind of influx of disinformation that's created a really a big space for problematic information to anchor itself in these social media platforms. So that's why I chose Canada. Now, Reddit itself, I wanted to study Reddit because it really encourages long form responses. As you probably know, there's been renewed activity on Canadian Reddit because of the tumultuous political environment. And because I'm looking specifically for discourse, so exchanges between individuals, a place like Twitter isn't really conducive to that. A place like Facebook is limit conducive to that, but Reddit is the best place to actually look at this. And because it best mimics a democratic public sphere, because there's moderators and people have a say in how Reddit is run, it felt like the best place to see how Canadians were interacting about politics. So that's why I chose Canada, and that's why I chose Reddit. Now, I use something called a netnography, and I'm going to walk you through netnography a little bit for those who are unfamiliar. So, as you can see here, netnography is a form of qualitative research that seeks to understand the cultural experiences that encompass and are reflected within what we call traces, online traces, the practices on social media, the networks that are formed, and the systems that are built into social media. So, netnography fits into the umbrella topic of online anthropology. The difference with a regular ethnography, so if you're going in person, is that obviously you're using online traces, right? A lot of researchers do what they call online ethnography. It's very similar to an ethnography, but the main difference is that an ethnography will focus on immersive engagement. So particularly you're required to keep an immersion journal in which you detail your feelings, your thoughts, your positionality as a researcher, but also what's going on, what are your thoughts, how do you want to direct your research, et cetera. So it really keeps a diary of your thought process, which as I worked on my immersion journal, I realized that for any method, I think I want a journal to keep to keep up with my thought process, because how many times has this happened to you where you're like, why did I make that decision again? And so it really forces you to keep track of that. So it's a great tool if you're seeking to understand a collective communication platform, studying human systems, human communication processes. It has a cultural focus on understanding the data specifically derived from social media data. Its components are basically there's data collection, data analysis, and data interpretation. So it's really a great tool if you want to have an appreciation for the context of people's everyday life, shared social systems of shared meaning, and it's informed because of the immersion journal. It's informed by a sense of self-awareness of the researcher too. So relevant to my work particularly, and I chose it because I'm trying to understand the effect of technological mediation on communication and on society. So we do have to update how we view communities. They're no longer these stable, committed relationships fixed in places, like in time zones or in physical locations. If you think like that, it's obscuring really important forces at work in our contemporary culture and society and how it's manifested through social media now. So it does demand immersive engagement. So it's much beyond just download and code content analysis. It requires intellectual engagement, active engagement, and the immersion journal again is a necessity. There's also a structure and a kind of practice or steps, which I'm going to walk you through in one moment, to the way that a ethnography is conducted. I use this book by Kozinets, which is he's kind of the father of this method, and it was a very helpful book to give me a little bit more structure to how I conducted my ethnography, especially as a first-time ethnographer. I was a bit lost, so it helped a lot. These are the steps. The reason I've color coded them is that I'm telling you where I'm at in my research. So the green is completed, yellow in progress, and red not there yet. So this is a screenshot, by the way, from my Reddit scraper. This is how I was extracting the data. Initially, I was doing it manually because I thought that would be so much more immersive, but it was taking so much time, and so I thought, no, I'm going to use a scraper while keeping my immersion intact. I'll talk to you about that in a second. So in the first phase, the initiation, you plan the study, you hone the research questions so it can lead to a research design that's conducive to an ethnography or an ethnographic inquiry. You might find in this process that ethnography is not the appropriate method for you, and that's okay, but that's why it's step one. Step two is the investigation. So social media becomes your cultural research site, like you're an archaeologist or something. So here you're focusing on the research question. First of all, you have to localize where these online traces, so these OTs are, to find the perfect site for your research question. So where are people talking about this? Is it a blog? Is it a Facebook community? Is it a Twitter community? You got to find the right space for your actual question. Then there's the immersion part, the most important part. So you immerse yourself, you keep a journal. This is where you learn in the community new languages, rituals, identities, values, stories, even hierarchies. Might include, depending on where you're at, rules in the community, frequent posters, type of content, timing of content. This is by far the longest and the most important phase. Now, interaction. I didn't do interaction, but if immersion is insufficient, you can choose to actually engage with the community. Some etnographers choose to engage with like subreddit mods, for example, or you can interview frequent blog posters, for example, or if there are particular posts that you found really interesting and compelling for your research question, some Facebook commentator, you can reach out to that Facebook commentator. Obviously, that will complicate your ethics process. I had a really quick ethics process because I tacked it onto my existing ethics process, my existing ethics application for my interviews and my experiments, etc. And so it was easier for me, and because I wasn't interacting, it was very much observational. So interaction might be necessary for your research question, but it will require more complex ethics approval. Now, the integration phase, ethnography is very much, I think, like most research, but it's very iterative. So if you feel in the process like you are looking for a depth of cultural understanding and you really haven't attained that sought after depth, you might need to adjust. Do you need another blog? Do you need another subreddit? Do you need more posts over a long period of time? I actually struggled with this, and I'll talk to you about it in a moment. You can return to immersion and interaction in this phase. You're kind of moving back and forth with them. You're even moving back and forth with your research question oftentimes. You might find something a lot more interesting than you were anticipating. So here you're going to build the representations, how you're going to represent the study that will incarnate the project, and you're going to bring it to basically a stage of completion. And then the incarnation is how are you communicating your research project? That's the last phase, the one we all dread the most, but that's the last one. So examples of ethnographic studies, ethnography extremely interdisciplinary. I just got back from Marseille where we had the NetnoCon, so the Netnography Conference, the yearly one. And my goodness, it is the most interdisciplinary conference I've ever seen. People from all academic disciplines. Um, I would even say in political science, I saw a couple of political scientists, but there really weren't many. A lot of people from the arts, a lot of people from library science, people from, there were even some scientists there. So it really, there was a marine biologist there that was presenting their work. And so it's a method that's very, how to say, it's very, oh, there's like a perfect word in French for this, but it can be used for many disciplines, basically. So examples of ethnographic studies. So for example, what are the factors that contribute to a memorable wine tourism experience, right? Maybe they go into a blog and they look at what makes a wine tourism experience very interesting. Actually, there's a lot of people that do marketing and consumer research that use ethnography, which makes sense. Another example is the discourse on activism in social media, the concept of a utopia. How do social media discourses on utopianism challenge the institution of capitalism? And what are the implications of this? And so you really can use ethnography for so many different things. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about mine ethnography now that you understand a little bit more what it is and how it works. So essentially, my research question was how the built environment of Reddit impacted Canadian political discourse in this very tumultuous political time. And so in the searching, scouting, and reconnoitering phase, this is what they call the kind of search phase, right? The goal for me was to map the landscape of Canadian political Reddit. Where are people speaking? Do you have a diversity of opinions and perspectives on all these subreddits? Am I taking accidentally two very conservative subreddits, or do I have a kind of variety of subreddits here? So you're mapping the terrain. Where are these conversations happening? And are these subreddits, center left, center right, etc.? And do I want to look at partisan subreddits, or is that not interesting for me? And so in this phase, I had to define my research parameters. So what was very important is that I had to have a systematic data collection process. A lot of people, when they run an ethnography, they do it in a much more, I can't think of the better word, but a much more casual way where there isn't a systematic data collection. It's more just an immersive experience. It really depends on your background. Because I'm in political science, my committee was very insistent on having a systematic data collection that can be replicated easily, et cetera. And so I did do that. And so what I decided to do was take the top 3 posts in the subreddits of interest every single day for the last, so every day I would get the top 3 posts in the last 24 hours. I would survey at minimum the top 10 comments and I would follow the thread. Okay, so especially if there's multiple responses, I would follow the thread. I focused on 2 subreddits, so R Canada and R On Guard for Thee, which is another Canadian political subreddit. My rules were that I needed subreddits that spoke about Canada, obviously, and politics and society more specifically. So not memes that had nothing to do or just humorous memes and stuff. I needed some more political conversations. Although I will admit that during my research, I found that satire is a really interesting space to discuss politics, but maybe that's for another paper. I did have some issues with data scraping. So initially, like I discussed, I was doing it manually. So I was going every day, copying the title, copying the amount of upvotes, etc. But it was taking time and it was really taking away from my immersion. And so through a lot of Googling, I was able to build some code that would allow me to scrape the data every day. And so I already had the data, and then I could just take the time to look through the subreddits, read through, take my notes, engage in my immersion journal, etc. But I did have issues and it delayed my work by a lot. The data scraping and especially automating this data scraping, because I'm not a coder, I know some R, I know some Python, but as you know, there's always issues with that. And it's always ironic because you're writing this to make things faster and it's actually taking you so much more time. But I got it done eventually. So in my immersion, I have a total of 18 hours and 20 minutes of immersion, which is not enough. We'll talk about it later, but it was a great start for me to have some preliminary findings. In my data collection, here are the variables that I pulled out. So posted date, subreddit title, type, user, upvote comment ratio, URL, etc. Here's a snapshot from my immersion journal. Kind of embarrassing notes, my general thoughts, but I wanted you to see the raw immersion journal, what's actually happening. It really is your raw thoughts that you have not edited, that you have not. It's very important not to edit these things because you want to go back and see what you were thinking at the time or what observations you have made at the time. Now I'll tell you about what I actually found on my Canadian political subreddits. So, first of all, I was surprised to see that there was a big culture of respect and empathy. I was particularly searching for what I call friction. So I was looking for exchanges when one commentator posts a comment, someone replies, and then there's a response. So when there's a minimum of 3 responses across 2 different users, this is where I was most focused because I wanted to look at the discourse and how people are speaking to each other, the words that they're using, the language they're using, is there empathy, is there name calling, etc. And how does that dictate how the rest of the conversation goes? I was looking for friction. I found that there was not a lot of friction. I went initially on our Canada and on our On Guard for Thee because one was considered center left and one was considered center right. I found that there was a lot of wording used that was quite empathetic. So, for example, a lot of users would say, "That's very interesting. However, I disagree because of these reasons," or, "Oh, I hear you and I see why you feel that way. However," so just those words, those sentences, those expressions that really help people's guard go down so that you can have an actual discourse, as opposed to the name calling and the insults and the kind of insulting jokes and remarks that would really stunt conversations. There was some of that, but I was surprised to see a lot of respect and empathy. I found that comments often provided a lot of nuance, and the comments that provided a lot of nuance were actually quite helpful to perpetuate discussion. Comments which did not provide nuance and that were very cut and dry in their responses, such as saying, "Well, you're ignorant, you don't understand XYZ," the replies would just stop. It wasn't conducive to that kind of discourse. Again, I was searching for friction, so I was searching for these exchanges. Obviously, there were some personal insults and name calling, but they were a lot less frequent. I had a bit of a light bulb moment because I realized that when I was mapping the terrain back in December and November, there was a lot more friction in these very same subreddits. So these same subreddits, I found that people were engaging in a lot more name calling and personal insults. People were quite rude to each other. There was a lot of stunted conversation, so challenges that went unanswered. And then I found that actually at this point in time, this was happening a lot less. We'll talk about the implications of that in just a moment. Now, of course, the built environment does restrict democratic discourse. I found that this was the case because of the stunted conversations, particularly. So, when challenges went unanswered, challenges to perspectives went unanswered, it really kept people staying steadfast in their beliefs. And those comments would get really, really upvoted because there were no real challenges to it later on. The award system was also a problem. So on Reddit, if you're a user, you can actually provide awards to other people. You can actually purchase these awards. And when you provide an award to a comment, the comment gets a colored background and it makes it a lot more prominent. And those comments tend to perform much, much better because they're much more visually appealing. But that doesn't mean they're more truthful. That doesn't mean that they're cited with sources. That doesn't mean they're less combative. It just means they're more visually appealing. And so people tend to go for them. Another problematic characteristic of the built environment that really stunted democratic discourse is the commenting tree. So on Reddit, how you reply to comments, when comments go past that 3 user reply, it's really, really hard to follow the flow of conversation. I've tried it on mobile and I've tried it on the computer, and in my immersion, I kept following these kind of friction, these moments of friction, and I often lost myself in the discourse and in the exchange. And so I can see from a user's perspective why there's no real incentive to continue these conversations because it is too complex to do so. And so the combination of the award system and the very complicated commenting tree really acts as a non-incentive to engage in the discourse that you might need for more nuance, more respect, and more empathy. Those were my preliminary findings with almost 20 hours of immersion. Now, looking ahead, as I was searching for friction, again, I found a lot less of it. Now, the question is, um, why is that the case? Do we Are we engaging in less friction because Canadians are genuinely more united right now? Is it a current affairs thing? Is it a cultural thing that Canadians just are more polite? I'm sure you've all heard the stereotype that we're quite polite and we say sorry for everything. Is this cultural? Does this have to do with current affairs? The other issue that I ran into is determining what is political. It seems so simple in my mind. Political means current affairs, but oftentimes people would post memes or would post funny statistics that had been manipulated, and people would engage in political discourse. So, does that constitute political discourse? Does that work within my research parameters? I had to ask myself that. Now, of course, there's the question of bots. This is the challenge that ethnographers will always get. Um, how do you know that the users you're engaging with are not bots? And that is a fair question. There are a couple of ways to address this. So the first one is to, answer that even when you're conducting interviews, people can be quite untruthful with you and you can't know or can lie to you. And so these effects also happen with other qualitative methods. The second one is that there's actually really interesting companies that are starting to have a foothold in academia, and what they do is that they kind of survey they survey your work, and they can determine with a bunch of different AI models that are validated by universities whether the behavior of a user can be associated with coordinated inauthentic behavior. So basically, they can detect with some percentage of certainty what are bots and what aren't. And so there are ways of validating your research. This is something that some ethnographers have done. It depends on access. It depends on money. There's a lot of questions here, but it is a challenge that you might get as an ethnographer, of course, which you would get as an ethnographer regarding your positionality, or what you'd get as an interviewer regarding whether people would lie to you as well. Now, I know going forward that I haven't reached research density, so I really need to increase my data collection. Because I saw such a different environment back in November, I realized that, hey, I don't know if this is a subreddit thing, if this is a cultural thing, if this is a current affairs thing. The reason why the sentiment has changed is this because people who were more center right have moved to other subreddits, right? So I need to increase my data collection to know for sure whether that's the case. And my idea is to actually convert this into, I'm a comparativist, so I can't help but compare, but maybe convert this into a temporal comparative analysis where I compare Reddit post-election and then Reddit pre-election, and to see if there's a difference in the type of discourse that is going on. I think that's the way I might tackle this. Now, bringing it back to democracy, we are seeing a contraction of the public square, as we have discussed, and we are seeing that these conversations are happening online, and we're better understanding how the built environment of social media is impacting the discourse that is happening. My contribution would be to problematize the existing theories. So, for example, Bayer did a research on what leads certain online communities to real world activism while others never get to that stage. It was very interesting work, by the way. She studied Anonymous, she studied World of Warcraft communities, etc. And so she was looking at the built environment and why certain platforms make it really, really complicated to discuss and get together. And that translates to less real world activism. So that was one study that did great work. And then Forrestal, of course, maybe you guys have heard that she argues that software design is a manifestation of power. And there are ways of building digital democratic environments. So if they form communities, if they sustain themselves over time, if they work to improve decisions, and that the decision-making process is democratized to meet the changing needs of the members, then you have a more democratic digital environment. So, but beyond the digital environment itself, I want to contribute by asking, how does culture and current affairs impact exchanges? What do these exchanges tell us about our fellow citizens and how we perceive our fellow citizens as well? So it's not to discount these existing theories. On the contrary, I stand on the shoulders of giants, and I want to problematize these existing theories and ask what precisely is happening in these environments that's making them really non-conducive to democratic discourse. And there's a lot we can learn from existing conversational tools. With the rise of polarization, there are a lot of conversational tools and organizations that use and teach these conversational tools that are becoming a lot more prominent. So, street epistemology is a modernization of the Socratic method of having democratic discourse, asking questions, getting to the origin of someone's beliefs. Collaborative decision making is a way for groups to get together and come to a consensus or an agreement on certain decisions, and building empathy. And so, what can we learn also from these tools that can tell us how we can have better democratic discourse between citizens, especially that disagree with each other? And because I'm always bringing it back to the policy outputs and what democracies can do, I'm really hopeful that a paper like this and papers like this and research like this can provide really practical tools to integrate all of these conversational tools on democratic discourse into digital literacy curriculum that is dispensed in schools or in nonprofit organizations. And so I hope that what we learned from what the digital public square is doing poorly, we can then import into the real world to do it better, essentially. That's my research. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Well, Valérie, thank you very much for presenting your research. It was very, I think, informative for most of our participants. That was the first time I actually heard about ethnography. It was very new to me. And also it was very interesting to listen to how you have actually done it, as well as your own research question and your experiences with Canadian subreddits. So thank you very much. It isn't always the case that we have our guests present based on qualitative methodology. So it's especially interesting when we have different kind of methodologies, and so our participants also see how the same or similar research questions can be studied in different ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I have Philip. For our audience participants, please feel free to share your questions. You can use Q&A functionality to send your questions so that I can just read them for you and Valérie can answer. I already have a question from Philip Henry. I will read it in case some of participants cannot see it, and then you can just engage Valérie. Canada subreddit is a bit infamous on Reddit for being for considerable time in the past run by a group of far-right moderators, which is why On Guard for T was originally founded. Did you see any structural differences in respect to the two communities, in particular in terms of their different histories and rules regarding hate, bigotry? And second question, again from Philip, in terms of disincentive to read replies through the way the content is presented, did you use the new Reddit interface or the old Reddit interface? If you haven't tried it, the latter may make it easier to access the content manually.
Thank you so much for those questions. And yes, so our Canada was infamous for being run by far-right moderators and this was about 7 years ago. There were a lot of articles written about it. And as a result, they really tightened up their moderation system and cleaned up the subreddit. However, it did remain quite conservative. And for a time, especially during COVID, it was quite far right, I would argue. But in the last couple of years, it has moved towards the center right. And this is why I had initially chosen that subreddit, because On Guard for Thee was quite center left. And so I didn't see, interestingly, large amount of differences between our Canada and our On Guard for Thee. Yes, on our Canada, there were more deleted comments by moderators. It is much more heavily moderated than on our On Guard for Thee, probably out of necessity more than anything. There were some comments that were deleted, but it wasn't as intense as I would have anticipated. And this is where my question came while I was doing my immersion was, are users becoming, is this better moderated? Or are users becoming more, are changing their discourse in response to this more heavy moderation because they don't want their comments deleted? Or have people who are more center right or far right migrated to different subreddits? And in the latter part of my research, I found that the subreddit r Canada Politics actually had a lot more friction. And so this was the next subreddit that I wanted to look at because it has a lot more exchange between citizens, between users that disagree with each other. However, I discovered this right before I left for my conference, and so I didn't get a chance to explore it yet, but I think this will be the next stage. But that's an excellent question, and I also had those concerns about our Canada as well. But it's cleaned up its act, so to speak. I think the more contentious discourse has moved to very partisan subreddits instead. The second question was regarding, the old or new. So I use the new interface, but very helpful to know that the old interface might actually be more helpful for me. That's great to know. And if you don't mind, is it more helpful to see comments and replies, that kind of tree, or was it for the actual extraction? And you can just email me if that's
And
easier.
Philip, if you want to respond, because we still have time. Yeah, if you want to say something and respond to Valérie.
Can you hear me? So first of all, really cool project. So I know my question was very much just on the Reddit, the practical details, but really cool project and really cool how you embedded this in a larger question. It's really fascinating. Sorry, so specifically on the old Reddit interface, yeah, is literally just a switch in the settings that you can flip, and then it makes it, especially on the large screen, a lot easier to just manually scroll the website, basically.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So for both for the comments and the actual content posted on the subreddit itself, what you do lose, obviously, what you mentioned earlier as well, is if someone uses any of the awards to highlight existing comments, existing content, or any of the kind of newer features around kind of embedding GIFs and well, Reddit has tons of new features that only work in the new Reddit interface. So you lose some of that kind of, I guess, organic interaction, because I think around 90% of the people use the new interface nowadays. So in a way, you create a bit of an artificial interface there for you, or an artificial prism, if you will. But yeah, I find that always helpful to browse Reddit on the old interface if I need to actually figure out what's going on there.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valérie, for the response. So there are two questions from Catherine, and I will just read them as well for our audience. At the beginning of the talk, you discussed digital literacy. I just wondered how you would define digital literacy, and if you could speak to how that differs cross-culturally. And do you see any connection between absence of critical digital literacy education and emphasis on educational technologies as solution to purportedly failing education systems in some contexts, such as the UK or the US?
Excellent question. And I don't think it's fair to ask me for a definition of digital literacy when no one has agreed on one. And that is the bane of my existence. But essentially, digital literacy is an understanding that traditional literacy skills, such as reading and mathematics, are no longer sufficient to navigate the information ecosystem in which we find ourselves. And so it's a kind of new set of competencies and skills, which, again, a lot of people don't like using the terms competencies and skills, but it's a new version of competencies and skills that revolve around critical thinking when engaging with information ecosystems, understanding the political economy underpinning big tech and how information is given to you, a demystification of AI and algorithms, which would lead you to understand why you are being shown the information you're shown, and why AI is not magic, but they're predictive, they're predictive technologies. Essentially, digital literacy, in my view, the point is to provide you with a framework of critical questions to ask when you're engaging with any digital app, a piece of information. So like if it's an app, like who made this? What are the incentives? How does it make me feel using it? Is somebody profiting from this, etc.? When you're interacting with a piece of information, how does this make me feel? Do other sources corroborate it? Why is this being shown to me, etc.? So digital literacy frameworks encompass all of these skills that we need to navigate the information ecosystem. And there are major differences between the hard skills of digital literacy, which include things like programming, or to your point, learning how to use digital technologies, and the soft skills, which are asking the framework of questions or understanding the political economy underpinning all of these digital technologies. And so there are countries that emphasize what they call digital literacy is, well, we're going to teach a bunch of people how to program because we need to train the new citizens of the digital world so that they can upskill and participate in our neoliberal digital economic system, right? So there's countries that perceive it that way. And then there's countries that also understand that digital literacy is a holistic approach that also includes the framework of questions and the critical approaches, to your point. And so there is a big difference. And you asked as well about, was it comparison across countries, or if there's some countries that are doing better than others? Was that it?
Yes, emphasis on educational technologies. Is this a solution to failing education systems in some contexts, such as the UK or US?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you see any connection between absence of critical digital literacy education and emphasis on educational technology?
Yes, absolutely. So countries that have very big investment in big tech, places like the US, for example, will have a lot less, we will see a lot less digital literacy initiatives. It's a little more complicated than that because I just thought it was, oh, well, they're investing in big tech, so they're not interested in investing in education. But actually, if you trace the process backwards, the countries that are doing well, so places like Finland and Estonia, they're doing well because digital literacy initiatives were born out of existing media literacy initiatives that started in the 1990s, because when the liberalization of all these digital technologies happened, places like Estonia and Finland realized that we cannot deploy the internet and expect that companies are going to just do what's best for our people. We need to pair this with investments in digital education, both the hard skills and the soft skills. Whereas in the US, there was a naive optimism that the development of the internet would be inherently democratizing, because if you invest in companies that will trickle down, that will allow the internet to be spread to the most amount of people, they will have access to information, and boom, democratizing, right? We now know that to be untrue. And so there is an entire history underpinning why it is that these countries are suffering or are not implementing digital literacy initiatives today. Partially a cultural problem, partially a historical problem, partially a money problem, like most things are, I think.
Thank you very much, Valérie. Well, wow, we have many questions coming.
Oh no, I got
Jessica,
myself in trouble.
and you know, people are interested in theoretical part as well as methodology, of course. So Jessica, who was actually the first presenter of this our spring session series, spring webinar series, is sending a question. Thank you, Jessica. It's great to see, of course, people who previously presented here. How would you think your findings would differ by social media platforms? Thinking about how platforms' composition also changed fast, like the recent migration from X to Blue Sky. I
That's
guess
an
this is a
excellent
question you
question.
receive a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I got a lot of challenges during the conference about why I'm not on X, why I'm not on, and I think it would differ greatly. I think discourse gets worse I think Reddit is one of the best iterations of democratic discourse that you're going to see, just because of the built environment, because users feel like they have a say in these communities to a certain extent, because it's heavily moderated, etc. I think places like Twitter, especially now, so like X at this moment right now, not heavily moderated at all, and so there is a lot of false information. As we know, that information does really, really well. The way that people speak with each other, just again by, I haven't done a study on X, but just by my anecdotal experience as a user, a lot more name calling, a lot less nuance, a lot less incentive to expand on perspectives and opinions, a lot less incentive to ask questions and challenge perspectives in a respectful way. So places like X and Facebook are not places where you're going to see democratic discourse. In fact, you're going to see a lot more friction, but a lot less back and forth as well, which is problematic in itself. And so that's definitely where you would see differences. I think the reason why Reddit is so interesting is because although it's still a digital platform, it's the closest to a democratic public square that you can have on the internet right now. And so it best mimics it. So I wanted to see, even in these places that are best mimicking the kind of in-person interactions, what are we seeing and how are people speaking to each other, essentially?
Thank you very much. One final question, and then finally I will ask my own question. Okay, as we have shifted from physical to digital public spaces, we have seen an explosion in disinformation that threatens democratic discourse. Given this vulnerability you have described, as digital media fundamentally undermines citizens' ability to function as effective political agents in the public sphere?
That's a really good question. And that is the question I'm grappling with. I am an eternal optimist, but I must admit this research has challenged my optimism. I do believe that we are living in an informational crisis at the moment, because in order to function as democratic political agents, we need access to information that is free from influence, and information that allows us to make decisions about governance. And at the moment, that access to information is challenged, partially because of social media platforms, but partially because most democratic governments are not providing us with the tools to navigate the new information ecosystem, while in parallel, legacy news media is struggling financially. And so we aren't having access to legacy news media as much. So what worries me the most is partially that our access to the information is disrupted, and partially that the responsibility and the onus is being put on individual citizens to navigate this new information environment, despite the fact that we haven't been provided with the tools to do so. And so the state has created the conditions that have made it so hard for us to navigate the information environment while not providing us with the tools to do so. So as a result, obviously, we're becoming more polarized. And again, like I mentioned earlier, what's scaring me is that in-person political and social conversations are happening a lot less frequently because these things are more taboo. People are more polarized, and so we're scared to engage in these topics with our friends and family and with strangers because we just don't know if they're going to fly off the handle or if we're going to fly off the handle having these conversations. And so I think our ability to function as political agents is severely disrupted at the moment, and that we need to respond, and very fast. This is not something that is a long-term planning. Think about it now. If you start implementing digital literacy in schools now, if you have a concerted digital literacy strategy, which we don't have in Canada, by the way, if you have that now, you're starting that now, that won't have an effect for another 20 years when these kids become voters. And so this is more than urgent at the moment. Now, I have to address the criticisms to my perspective. And one of the criticisms is that believing that individuals in democracies take information, let it process, discuss democratically with other people, let it change their prior beliefs, and then make a rational decision at the polls is a democratic ideal that is unrealistic, and that really people vote due to tribalism or due to pre-existing notions that are extremely hard to shake. So due to identity and values that are very, very hard to shake. And so we might be overreacting because no matter how much more information we get, our identities and values are so fixed that more information might not make a huge difference. So these are some criticisms that I might get in response to my perspective, but I think I've read enough terrifying research, peer-reviewed research, to know that we are in an institutional and interpersonal trust crisis right now, and the way that we access information is not conducive to making choices about democratic governance at the moment.
Well, thank you very much for the detailed response. So one final question about the methodology you have been using, about ethnography, I would like to ask. This is, like, it's not a method that we hear much about. So when you present your own research methodology in your department, a political science department, or in conferences, what kind of questions are you receiving with respect to your methods, methodological choices or methodological framework? What kind of pushback you receive, and whether, especially, like with respect to the difference between quantitative text analysis on the one hand and ethnography on the other hand, do people understand how ethnography differs, how not? This is two questions, actually, two different questions. But yeah, I would like to hear your experiences. I would like to hear about your experiences, especially in case there are some others in the audience who consider using ethnography in their own research.
That's an excellent question. I have only presented my work at this ethnography conference where everyone is so nice about ethnography, of course. And so though I did get some challenges, they're probably not the hardest challenges. I did get some challenges from my committee. So I will tell you that one of the main challenges you're going to get is, how do you know they're not bots? That's the main one you're going to get. How do you know that the information you're engaging with is really users sharing their actual opinions? So that's the first pushback that you're going to get. The second one is, how is this different from an online ethnography, which again, the immersion journal is the big difference. So the actual immersion in the space is the big one. Another challenge I got, and again, I have quantitative scholars on my committee, so of course I would get this response, is why don't you do a sentiment analysis? Why don't you just do like a quantitative content analysis? And my answer to that is, you can do an ethnography along with a content or a network or a sentiment analysis, but the question is, how does it respond to your research question? Does it respond to your research question? Does it help it along? Yes or no? In my case, it doesn't, because I'm specifically looking at democratic discourse and specific exchanges. And I cannot understand details if I just do a sentiment analysis. Now, I might do one to, appease a quant journal if I want to get it published there. But that's not what is going to respond to my personal research question. It might do so for somebody else. And so that's how you can respond to like a quantitative challenge is that it depends on your research question itself. There was another piece of feedback that I had gotten about netnography. Well, I mean, of course, the challenge is what you had initially said, right? Is that it's not a recognized method, or it hasn't been, it's not as familiar. Now, what I would say is that online ethnography is quite familiar, and netnography is very similar with the addition of this immersion in the immersion journal. And there has been a lot of work published on ethnography, which I didn't know until I started exploring it. So there is a lot of peer-reviewed research, this book itself. There's a lot of articles that are written on using ethnography, etc. And it's an excellent tool to actually immerse yourself in. If you accept that there are communities online, an ethnography makes complete sense because you're observing much like you would in an ethnography in person. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. So here I will be stopping the recording.